Thank you all for coming. As I said last time when we got together, that my suggestion was, when it's all over, to pass a hat, put money in it to expand parking, but I don't think it happened. We're doing Westport and the biggest colony of them all, Old Lyme. So, to get into this, Westport title is roughly 25 miles north of Cuscob and a coastal community. It developed differently than all the other colonies throughout the state, given its proximity to New York. The town was a natural location and attraction for commercial illustrators who conducted most of their daily work in the city in New York. Westport town records indicate 160 illustrators resided there between 1900 and 1940. Often town residents posed for these artists. The town's rich history is symbolized by the Minuteman sculpture, which commemorates the Revolutionary War Battle of Campo Hill, fought in 1777. The art community grew rapidly from 1900 to 1910, when fine artists, sculptors began arriving and settling in the town, nestled along the Saugatuck River. A more diverse group of artists compared to the other Connecticut colonies. The Westport art colony seemed to encourage a more experimental and open atmosphere. Its broad mixture of fine artists, illustrators, sculptors, and even writers produced a congenial group not dominated by one primary style or theme, as in Cuscob and Old Lyme. Among the earliest to settle in Westport in 1907 was the artist, illustrator, and etcher George Hand Wright. Brought up in Pennsylvania and raised as a Quaker, Wright preferred simplicity and modesty. He was not a self-promoter. Fellow artists paid tribute to him. Quote, George Wright was an accomplished painter and colorist, a highly sensitive and imaginative artist, and natural draftsman of unusual powers, end of quote. He was highly regarded among other artists and illustrators, achieving the coveted full membership to the National Academy of Design in New York, and that was a coveted prize. This New York street scene was painted in 1901 while Wright was still a resident of the city, but growing anxious to settle in a rural environment emulating his childhood upbringing. Subjects that interested him the most were the nostalgic images of rural settings, blacksmiths, farmers, carpenters, all presented sensitively and with humor. But as a successful illustrator, contributing to every important family magazine of the day and illustrating 25 books between 1890 and 1920, he was called the father of illustrators. And the array of stories and images like this work entitled The Smart Set, very much against his basic instincts, but as an illustrator, he had to illustrate the works that were assigned to him. Post-1920s, Wright stated he sought out those yet unspoiled places where the old ways of doing things still lingered. This took him to places like New Orleans and Beaufort, South Carolina, or Beaufort, however you pronounce it, where this candidly honest watercolor was painted. First is entitled Visiting Day. Wright's concern for the life of the African American is addressed with works like this in South Carolina. This second piece, entitled Mandy's House, most likely painted the same time. Both of these, or one of these, are on display here. By the 1930s, his interest changed quite a bit, and he focused more on pastel, and especially this exceptional pastel reflects Wright's preference for rural imagery, entitled Harvest Time, Westport, as well as his ability to master aspects of Impressionist techniques. However, from the 30s on, Wright's greatest focus and recognition from other artists was his etching. This strongly composed etching is entitled Back to Earth, executed in 1943. It was exhibited at the Society of Etchers and drew praise and was chosen as the, quote, members' premium. By 1950, most of the nationally recognized artists had passed away, and George Hand Wright became, quote, the elder statesman status was extended to him in Westport and in the artist community. Among the fine artists attracted to Westport was Lawrence Mazanovich, or Mazanovich, I've heard it pronounced both ways, who arrived in 1909, 2 years after George Wright. Born at sea in 1871 off the coast of California of immigrant parents. The family moved several times, eventually settling in Chicago. He attended the Chicago Art Institute, studied at the Art Students League in New York, and in 1902 left for studies in Paris, remaining there for 7 years. He returned to the U.S. in 1909 as a committed Tonalist, reflecting his exposure to the French Barbizon style of painting. Gradually, his style evolved in what a critic of the day described as, quote, a unique blend of tonalism, combined broken brush work, and sparkling colorism. This produced a decorative tendency to pattern and symmetry. Now, this sounds a little bit like fancy art speak, which I swore to avoid, but it does say that Mazzy, as he was called, was finding his own voice. In addition to his easel painting, he did design work for the Roycroft Press in East Aurora, New York. Mazzy did exhibit regularly in Chicago and New York, and he soon established himself as the premier landscape painter among the Westport group of artists. This piece, which is on display here, is entitled Autumn Colors, reflects his mature style in subject, composition, sophisticated and elegant brushwork, and palette. Mazzy did adopt the Impressionist practice of painting plein air or outdoors, but only up to a point. He preferred to do several sketches of a scene and then retreat back to his studio and arrange the composition as he saw fit. He did not slavishly adhere to the scene that he just observed. He was not a religious man, but he found a mystical satisfaction and solace in nature. His color choices could produce non-naturalistic scenes, but still be believable. Declared a critic, Mazanovich was one of the country's finest practitioners of this rather post-impressionist application or approach. Now, up to this point, art colony life sounds collegial, carefree, idyllic. One must remember, artists were human with the same weaknesses and jealousies that we all have, but perhaps they had more fun doing it. In 1923, a rather public and nasty affair with another artist's wife caused Mazzy to abruptly leave Westport and his family and relocate in Tryon, North Carolina. Another artist colony, and ironically, the acclaimed modernist Arthur Dove, also a resident of Westport, left his wife at the same time. The two wives got together and opened a boarding house. Now that is artist-wife resiliency. Among other artists' residents in Westport was the acclaimed illustrator and fine artist Carl Anderson, who settled in Westport in 1912. With years of study and exposure to leading Impressionists in France, Anderson was fully committed to strong Impressionism as seen in this major work entitled The Apple Gatherers. With Mazanovich as the colony's leading landscape artist, Anderson was the most prominent portrait, figure, and genre painter. Now, Harold von Schmidt, he's interesting. The nationally prominent illustrator was the real deal. Born in 1893 in California and raised by a grandfather who was a 49er during the gold rush. He worked as a cowboy, lumberjack, sailor, hunter, rodeo rider, and member of the 1920 and 1924 American Rugby Olympic team, and he flew both B-24s and B-25 on bombing runs in the Pacific during World War II. Von Schmidt moved east and settled in Westport in 1927. He was an instructor in the correspondence program of the famous artist school, and we were talking with somebody here before this started about that. That is in Westport, and he was the president of the Westport Artists Association. Now, not surprisingly, he specialized in Western theme art like this dramatic poster for the movie Fort Apache. Harold von Schmidt's work is found in virtually every major museum and private collection of Western work. Now, we move to Old Lyme. With the early and untimely deaths of Kotskob's spiritual leader, John Twachtman, in 1902, and Theodore Robinson in 1896, the largest and ultimately the most influential colony developed in Old Lyme. Once a prosperous shipbuilding center, suffered an economic decline until the return of the artists began settling into Old Lyme in very large numbers. Initially founded by the reigning tonalist artist of the day, Henry Ward Ranger, 1858 to 1916, in 1899, who vehemently disliked Impressionism. This is an example of Ranger's tonalist style of painting. He envisioned Old Lyme as the perfect location for, quote, an American Barbizon, as he called it. Well, all was not rosy. However, the story of Old Lyme features the conflict between Henry Ward Ranger and the steady stream of Impressionist artists returning from their studies in Europe. Finally, with the arrival of the leading Impressionists of the day, Child Hassam, their differences escalated and the feud continued until the Impressionists forced the opinionated Ranger to leave Old Lyme, eventually settling in Noang. Now, unlike Cascade, Old Lyme was a community where large numbers of its members moved, lived, and worked there as the colony grew. It centered around the indomitable Florence Griswold, whose grand home and property provided a central location for social events. Tender-hearted and committed to art, Miss Griswold also offered assistance and financial aid to newly arrived artists. Her contribution to Old Lyme, if not Impressionism itself, cannot be overestimated. One of the many artists who boarded at Griswold House wrote the following: "My first impression of Florence Griswold, the petite and ageless spirit around whose vivacious personality grew America's most famous art colony. I would see she was a born hostess with that lovely air and remarkable gift of making her guests feel like it was their home and she was visiting them. And one seemed to feel that sunshine followed her wherever she went, perhaps because she was forever trying to help others." End of quote. Another resident of Griswold House amusingly noted, quote, "It was no mean achievement to reconcile and keep peace with one another of a group of highly individualistic and creative men and women who not infrequently acted like schoolchildren. Her optimism was unquenchable and her personality so persuasive that everyone who went there came under her spell." Quite a lady. Frank Vincent Dumont, once described as, quote, "an art treasure for our state of Connecticut," was among the earlier artists to settle into Old Lyme, first visiting the colony in 1902 and becoming a permanent resident in 1906. He became one of the most respected and dedicated instructors of all time, teaching at the Art Students League in New York for 59 years. His advanced theories on color harmonies, compositions are relevant to this day. Among the scores of students on whom he left his indelible mark was Georgia O'Keeffe, Norman Rockwell, John Marin, and Charles Hawthorne. A featured and exhibited example by Dumont, which is over there, is the brilliant and complex composition entitled Old Lyme Garden, circa 1915. This is a prime example of his controlled form of Impressionism, use of intense green color, which actually became known as Dumont green. Here, Dumont has joined angular precision with the random, free characteristics of traditional landscape painting. This unique work, which is outside in the gallery area, this unique work is called Lime Rock, which was a challenging subject for many of the Old Lyme Impressionist artists to paint over the years. Typical of Dumont, whose teaching encouraged his students to push elements of painting technique to their limits. In this work, Dumont pushed high-key color palette to its limits. Nobody tackled this scene with a bolder, more imaginative color scheme than this. A close-up reveals Dumont's distinctive, short, choppy brushwork and subtle impasto, which is the surface texture. In 2001, I lent this piece to the Bruce Museum for a major retrospective on Dumont. To my happy surprise, the art press singled out this work, saying, quote, "The standout of the show is a freely brushed view of boulders, trees, and yellowing leaves bathed in sunlight. The evocative image, brilliantly captured on canvas, is a real beauty." End of quote. Dumont's work ethic was legendary, teaching 3 intensive workshops daily for 6 days a week, followed by student critiques on Sunday. The thing that competed with his love for painting and teaching in his life was fly fishing. The month of August was reserved for trips to Cape Breton and the Margaree River, often called the finest fly fishing in North America, accompanied by his close friend, Willard Metcalf, are pictured here with one of them catching a fish further downstream. You can see it splashing in the water. The appeal of Old Lyme to artists and tourists alike has lasted to this day. Now, in contrast to Dumont's more than half-century living in Old Lyme is Wilson Irvine. Did not move to Old Lyme until he was 45 years old in 1914. After several years in Chicago and Europe, throughout his career, his restless nature prompted him to frequent and lengthy travels, including Cornwall, Wales, the Outer Hebrides, London, Glasgow, Paris, Quebec, Avignon, New Orleans, Charleston, etc. that man was on the move. Despite his travels, Irvine was highly respected as a gifted impressionist and frequent exhibitor throughout the country with works of this quality, entitled Winter in the Valley. A keen observer at one of his exhibitions stated, quote, "Among the high spots of the show, one would mention Irvine's canvases. His reputation is so secure that brilliant performances from him are taken as a matter of course." End of quote. This panoramic view, entitled Meeting House Hill, painted in 1925, is a complex composition that captures the random, scattered image of an old New England town. Although primarily a landscape artist, Irvine also did figural work, often of his family members. This is a stunning and very professional image of a young lady in an outdoor, natural setting. Winter Laundry, perfect title. This winter scene illustrates two things. Landscape artists love to paint snow with its light and color reflections. And secondly, hanging laundry is a wonderful tool for the artist, and it gives him permission to inject colors and shapes into the composition that ordinarily would not appear in nature. This is a powerful device. At a casual glance, one might think Irvine was a talented but traditional impressionist, wed to its conventional style and composition. That would be incorrect. Widely respected as an experimenter, Irvine developed new techniques for monoprints and aquatint, as well as executing his impression paintings in a style that he called prismatic painting, or trying to create images that appear to be seen through a prism and the effect that it produces. Irvine used a technique that involved looking at his subjects through prisms attached to his eyeglasses. He would then introduce the refracted light to his canvases, outlining the objects in his composition with rainbow hues. It accentuates the effect of light on the edges of the objects being painted. This landscape appears to be at an extreme application of Irvine's, quote, prismatic experimentation. This close-up of a section of the painting you were just looking at would appear to be uninterpretable. It is believed, however, this experiment met with very mixed response from the public. Wilson Irvine was a solid and prolific artist, and although he remained a realist in the face of modernism, he did not, quote, stand still. He continued to experiment and evolve. In 1924, Irvine was quoted as saying, quote, "Any painter who in this day and age clings tenaciously to one thing which he can do best in a technical sense and is satisfied is not only standing still, he's retrograding." End of quote. Another artistic quote, Wilson Irvine, prolific, talented as a painter, honorable and distinguished as a man, left a legacy of capturing the very elegance, the light, the color, and the spirit of the places he visited. A masterful impressionist, he combined a thoughtful mind together with deeply trained eyes and hands to create enduring and captivating images of the world around us. End of quote. The third old Lyme artist to be featured here in some detail is Chauncey Ryder, whose early studies were at the Chicago Art Institute in 1891, followed by residing in Paris from 1901 to 1907. While studying paintings and exhibiting at the Paris Salon, his work tended to be rich in detail, as this marvelous piece shows, entitled Harbor at Etapes, with several vessels, sails, and scores of figures in the foreground. This second example, entitled View Across the Seine, shows an increased amount of empty space, with the sky taking roughly half of the composition. This hints at the slow, gradual evolution of Ryder's work. Upon return to the U.S., Ryder's association with Old Lyme began around 1909. Although his home was in rural Wilton, New Hampshire, he was a fully accepted member of the Old Lyme colony. Now, what you see here is an image of a special tradition coveted by the artist. Permission to paint a panel in Florence Griswold's house. This is a group of them. This is the panel occupied by Ryder's landscape. This dining room space is full of Old Lyme artists' contribution. They are still there today. This richly painted winter scene, entitled Blue Coal, is a featured example that's on the table over there. Like much of Ryder's work, it avoids the depiction of a recognizable place or a specific location. His approach to Impressionism, after this association with Old Lyme, was often a patchwork of broad stroke layering thick pigments of paint often applied with a palette knife. Oil was Ryder's primary medium, but he also produced unique watercolor, like this broadly painted piece entitled Edge of the Pasture. It reveals his gradual trend towards less of nature's detail and more broadly applied passages of paint. This work, entitled Sandy Road, shows this evolution. Often his later landscapes pushed representational elements towards almost abstraction. A critic observed in 1922, quote, "Mr. Ryder has sensed the right proportion between real and unreal, between detail and vagueness, and strength or tenderness. I sense a bit of art speak in this description. However, this piece may represent Chauncey Ryder's ultimate goal of simplicity, with just sand and sky, which, not surprisingly, is the title." Another critic of the period nailed it perfectly, stating, "Ryder paints with a freedom and facility which is not deterred by quibbling detail." There are no quibbling details in this picture. As the largest of the Connecticut art colony, there are scores of other prominent artists worthy of mention, but time allows for a limited selection. With the arrival of Childe Hassam in Old Lyme, the colony quickly became the center for Impressionism. His close friend, Willard Metcalf, quickly sealed the Impressionist identity. They both painted images of the Congregational Church, a popular image that many of the artists painted. Hassam's version is a classical, light-filled interpretation entitled simply Church, Old Lyme. In stark contrast, Metcalf seems to draw a bit from his earlier Tonalist approach, more intimate, not a full rendition of the building, and a late afternoon or early evening time of day. If there is one photo of Old Lyme that you're likely to have seen, it's this image of a number of the artists gathered around a meal on Griswold's house porch. The figure at the head of the table is Childe Hassam. This wonderful piece by the prolific Old Lyme artist William Chadwick is the identical location, as you can tell from the lattice work on the left side of the picture. Charles Ebert became an important member of Old Lyme after his wife talked him out of illustration work in New York. Good for her. Like most of the other artists in Old Lyme, Ebert was primarily an Impressionist landscape painter who settled there in 1919. This piece is entitled Spring in the Cove. The best Impressionist painter of cattle, this is interesting, is not west of the Pecos, not at all. It was Edward Volkert in Old Lyme. He came to the colony in 1922 and applied really strong and bold light and shadow patterns to his paintings. One of the immediately recognized landmarks to paint was Bradbury Mill, and Edward Rooke painted it several times. Well-to-do, a bit eccentric, Rooke was well respected among his fellow artists, who were a little bit disappointed that he didn't make greater efforts to promote himself. Perhaps being well-to-do contributed to that. Who knows? Another well-recognized symbol of Old Lyme painting is, here we go, mountain laurel. I saw so many of these pictures putting it together. I couldn't figure out who did what. Connecticut's state flower. Many artists painted it. This is Childe Hassam's version, and that Childe Hassam, painted in 1905, certainly set an enviable standard. English-born William Chadwick was one of many artists to reside for a period at Florence Griswold's house before becoming a permanent residence in Old Lyme for over 40 years. His laurel painting was a more panoramic view entitled Hamburg Cove, view of Lower Bay and Connecticut River. Edward Rooke, whom we just mentioned a moment ago, offered his contribution to the laurel paintings dated 1905. His version appears to picture the Lieutenant River in the distance. Now, of course, John Henry Twachtman has to have an entry into the laurel painting competition with this masterpiece entitled Greenwich Gardens, executed in the late 1890s. Guy Wiggins became nationally recognized primarily for his New York City snow scene, but was a resident of Old Lyme, where he painted exquisite landscape of the surrounding countryside, like this work entitled Late Afternoon Winter. Lush and often wild gardens were plentiful in Old Lyme, and a popular subject among both the artists and the patrons alike. A writer of the day described the American garden. Interesting description. Fair, rich confusion, the greater the confusion, the richer the garden. Entitled Miss Florence Garden, was painted in 1910 by Frank Bicknell, a popular member of Old Lyme and close friend of Miss Florence, who introduced him to President Woodrow Wilson and his wife, who was a painter, and a good one. They purchased several of his works. Another well-known garden image was painted in 1914 by Clark Voorhees, entitled simply My Garden. He has the distinction of being the first artist to discover Old Lyme in 1896 while riding his bicycle in the area. He later became a permanent resident. This is a photo of the Old Lyme artist George Burr, painting plein air, most likely his wife and child. And this is his contribution to garden pictures, always popular among artists and their patrons. Old Lyme had its father and son painters as well, George and Bertram Bristol. George's father work is entitled Stonehouse. He favored landscapes including gritty buildings. He was one of the earliest artists to arrive in Old Lyme, just visiting in the late 1880s. His son Bertram was raised in Old Lyme and often accompanied his father on painting trips. This piece, which is on the table, entitled Farmhouse, reflects his father's teachings, both in style of Impressionism and interpretation of the surrounding landscape. The allure of Old Lyme attracted artists from other parts of the country, often to attend summer art classes. Alexis Fournier was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, and became a major artist throughout the Midwest. His often high-key landscapes were among the finest of arts and crafts paintings. Impressionism, it works like this piece that we're looking at here, which, frankly, if not titled on the reverse in the artist's hand, Old Lyme Cove, I would not have known of its location. This pair, that's a close-up of it, this pair of broadly painted figures are by the acclaimed portrait artist both in Europe and in the U.S. named Louis Betts. The scene is a garden party on Miss Florence's property. Betts worked extensively in the Midwest and in New Orleans. It's unknown how often he visited Old Lyme, but he was an enthusiastic fly fisherman, so perhaps he was there meeting up with Frank Vincent Dumont. Of course, many of the Old Lyme artists painted abroad. Highly regarded Robert Vona resided in Old Lyme over many summers. Vona was an early adapter of Impressionism from his frequent and lengthy stays in the French colony of Grèze. This painting is among the best of his works. Finest and certainly symbolic is his masterpiece, Flanders Field, Poppies, painted in 1890. An unintended connection, 25 years later, amid the carnage of World War I, Canadian officer and surgeon John McCrae penned the most emotional and memorable poem of war. In Flanders Field, where poppies grow. He wrote it in 20 minutes during the Battle of Ypres, an abbreviation of his words. Quote, in Flanders Field, where poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, we are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunsets glow. The torch of faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Field. An amazing piece of work. And he was killed shortly thereafter. And that's a close-up of Robert Vona's painting in Flanders Field. And that wraps up Old Lyme. So we've looked at, and it's a remarkable coincidence that Connecticut, a small state, garnered more than double the number of Impressionist colonies than any other state in the country. Quite fascinating. Prompted by, as everybody keeps saying, a lot of cheap rent. That was a big help. And that's an image of Flanders Field in decades afterwards, and you can see the trenches and sandbags, what have you. So there we are, folks. Done.
Thank you, Tom. Can we thank
No
you
longer.
all for being here today and for
Thank you.
sticking with us throughout this series. Thank you, Tom.